June 8, 1944. Normandy, France. The morning air carries the smell of cordite and wet earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a machine gun fires in short, deliberate bursts. The sound rolls across the fields like a stone skipping over still water, mechanical, indifferent, relentless. The sky above the Norman countryside is overcast, a pale gray ceiling pressing down on a landscape older than memory itself. The fields are impossibly small, and the lanes between them barely wide enough for a single cart. And everywhere, in every direction, the hedgerows stand. They rise from the earth like walls built by something older and far more patient than any army. They are matted with vines, thick with oak and hawthorn and centuries of growth, their roots so deeply buried in raised earthen embankments that they seem less like vegetation and more like the bones of the countryside itself. For the men of the United States Army, and many of whom had never set foot in Europe before the morning of June 6th, the sight of the Norman bocage is not what the maps had prepared them for. The maps had shown open ground and straight roads. The maps had not shown this maze, this fortress made of roots and silence and shadow. This is where American armor came to a grinding halt, and where, in the weeks that followed, and one of the most remarkable acts of battlefield improvisation in the entire history of mechanized warfare, would be born. A solution so simple, so raw, so brutally practical that it would shatter the German defensive line and change the course of the war in Western Europe. But first, before any of that, came the stalemate. To understand what happened in the summer of 1944 along the hedgerows of Normandy, one must first understand what those hedgerows truly were. And the bocage, the word itself is Old French, meaning mixed woodland and pasture, was not merely an obstacle. It was a landscape with 1,000 years of history embedded in its soil. Since the Middle Ages, Norman farmers had used earthen embankments to divide their fields, to mark property lines, to shelter their livestock from the brutal Atlantic winds that swept in from the sea. Over the centuries, these embankments grew, they hardened. Trees and shrubs took root along their crests, their branches interlacing above sunken lanes to create tunnels of vegetation so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate. By 1944, the typical Norman hedgerow stood between 12 and 15 feet high, resting atop an earthen base that was often 4 feet thick at its foundation, more solid than most brick walls. The fields they enclosed were almost claustrophobically small. Most were less than 500 yards across. Many were less than 200. Yet this was not a place designed for tanks. It was not a place designed for modern infantry combat. It was a place designed for cows and sheep and the quiet work of farming. And yet in the summer of 1944, it became one of the most contested and deadly pieces of ground in the entire war. The German army had been in France since 1940. 4 years is a long time, long enough to study a landscape, to read its contours the way a general reads a tactical map. Yet the Wehrmacht and SS divisions stationed in Normandy did not merely occupy the bocage. They absorbed it. They understood it. They turned every hedge into a fortress wall, every sunken lane into a concealed approach route, every farm field into a kill zone. Machine guns were dug directly into the base of the embankments, their fields of fire carefully calculated to sweep the ground approaching each gap. Mortar teams set up their instruments behind the ridgelines, pre-sighting distances so that they could drop rounds onto any point in the fields ahead without needing to adjust. German snipers climbed into the ancient trees and waited with a patience that bordered on the inhuman. Anti-tank guns were positioned at the corners of hedgerow intersections, hidden behind the vegetation with their barrels pointing down the narrow lanes where any advancing armored vehicle would have no room to maneuver. The defenders were connected by field telephone, yet the whole system interlocked like a puzzle, each part reinforcing every other. Hitler had issued his directive clearly. Normandy was to be held. His commanders on the ground were to mount what he called a stubborn defense. In the bocage, stubborn defense was not merely an order, it was a geometric reality. And so, when the American army moved inland from the beaches on the morning of June 7th and the days that followed, it moved into something it had never trained for, never truly anticipated, and was entirely unprepared to overcome. The intelligence reports and aerial photographs that had guided the Allied planning for Operation Overlord had identified the hedgerows on the maps. They had been marked, noted, catalogued. What those reports had failed to convey, what no map could convey, was the psychological weight of the bocage in motion. The terror of not being able to see beyond 10 yards in any direction. The helplessness of watching a tank, the most powerful piece of equipment on the American arsenal's ground forces roster, become completely neutralized by a wall of dirt and roots. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, drove into the Norman interior on June 8th and surveyed the landscape that his forces were attempting to cross. He said afterward, with a characteristic plainness, that it was the damnedest country I've seen. It was not a complaint. Yet it was a tactical assessment, and it was absolutely correct. The Sherman tank, the M4 medium tank that had become the workhorse of the American armored forces, was designed for open ground. It was fast, mechanically reliable, and produced in such enormous numbers that it could be replaced almost as quickly as it was destroyed. By the end of the war, some American factories would produce more than 86,000 tanks in total, a staggering figure that dwarfed the combined output of every other major belligerent. But in the bocage, raw numbers and factory output meant almost nothing. When a Sherman attempted to push through a Norman hedgerow using its own power, the result was catastrophic. The tank would climb the earthen embankment, its belly rising, its hull pitching upward at a steep angle. At the crest, the tank would expose its underside, its thinnest, most vulnerable armor, to whatever German weapon was waiting on the other side. A Panzerfaust at close range, a 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, even a determined German soldier with a concentrated explosive charge. The tank, in that moment of exposure, was not a weapon. It was a target. The American Army's standard solution in the early weeks of the campaign was to identify the gaps in the hedgerows, the openings that connected one field to another, and funnel its tanks through them. But the Germans had anticipated this. Every gap was covered. Every lane was an ambush. Every opening was a death sentence. Studies conducted after the war would conclude that as much as 75% of all American casualties in Normandy were the result of German mortar fire, a weapon perfectly suited to the concealed, lobbing trajectory required by the bocage terrain. The Americans were fighting with their eyes open in a place that gave them nothing to see. In the first weeks following D-Day, the Allied advance slowed to a crawl. The distances gained each day were measured in hundreds of yards, yet sometimes less. The price paid for each field, each cluster of farm buildings, each crossroads hamlet was measured in American lives, young men from Missouri and Ohio and Georgia who had crossed an ocean and now found themselves bleeding out in the mud behind a medieval earthen wall in northern France. Between the landing on June 6th and the end of July, the American armies in Normandy suffered approximately 40,000 casualties. The stalemate was real. The crisis was real. And the frustration, in the forward trenches, in the tactical command posts, and all the way up to Omar Bradley's headquarters, was equally, devastatingly real. Meanwhile, on the German side, something different was happening. Something that would, in time, become the central irony of the Normandy campaign. The German commanders and the soldiers defending the bocage had not anticipated that the Americans would remain trapped in it for this long. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had argued, and before the invasion, that the Allies needed to be destroyed on the beaches within the first 24 hours, because once they were ashore and consolidating, German armored forces, constrained by their own command structure and by the constant threat of Allied air power, would struggle to deliver a decisive counter-attack. Rommel had been right in theory, but even he had not fully calculated the degree to which the bocage itself would do the work for the German defense. Yet the Hedgerows were buying time, and time was the one thing the Wehrmacht in the West could never afford to waste. German officers watching the American sector observed something that gave them genuine confidence. The Shermans were stopping, not from German guns alone, but from the terrain itself. The great American armored force, the force that had crushed Axis resistance in North Africa, that had raced across Sicily, that had arrived in France with the full weight of a continent's industrial production behind it, was being stopped by thousand-year-old farming walls. Every day that the Americans did not break out was another day that the German defensive line held. Another day that reinforcements, however battered and fuel-depleted, could be brought forward. Another day that the map remained unchanged. German frontline troops dug into their embankments with their MG-42s and their mortars. It understood that as long as the Shermans could not penetrate the hedgerows directly, every armored advance would funnel itself into a predictable, manageable channel. They could see the gaps. They had them covered. The American tank crews, for their part, knew it too. Veterans who survived described the experience of moving through the bocage in a Sherman as something close to navigating a labyrinth while blindfolded. They could hear the shells coming. They could not always predict from where. Yet they could not choose their own route of advance. They were prisoners of the geography in a tank that had been designed to liberate everything it touched. It was in this atmosphere of stalemate and accumulated frustration that a young American soldier arrived at the answer. Not in a planning room, not behind a general's desk, but in the field, in the mud, in the ordinary, brilliant, stubbornly practical tradition of the American fighting man finding a solution where no manual had thought to look. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III was born on February 10, 1915, in a small town in New Jersey. He was, by any standard account, an ordinary man. He had no engineering degree. He had no formal training in armored vehicle design. He was a non-commissioned officer in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a 2nd Armored Division, part of the great American force that had crossed the English Channel and found itself staring at the same walls every other unit had been staring at for weeks. But Curtis Cullen looked at those walls differently. He looked at them the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine, not with despair, but with the specific curiosity of a man who believes that every problem has a physical solution if you are willing to think hard enough and work with what you have. During a discussion with fellow soldiers in early July 1944, a discussion that was, by several accounts, partly born from frustration and partly from dark humor, someone suggested half-seriously that what the tanks needed were tusks, like a rhinoceros, something to drive into the base of the hedge and tear it apart from the roots rather than attempting to climb over it. The idea was not entirely new. Lieutenant Charles B. Green of the 747th Tank Battalion had experimented with salvaged railroad ties bolted to the bow of a Sherman for a similar purpose. But Cullen saw further. He saw not just the concept of prongs, but their material source. And the material source was lying scattered all across the beaches of Normandy in almost unlimited quantity. Check hedgehogs. The Germans, in their meticulous preparation of the Atlantic Wall, it had planted thousands of these welded steel obstacles on the invasion beaches. 3 interlocking steel I-beams, bolted at their centers to form a 6-pointed star of iron capable of tearing the hull from a landing craft or immobilizing a tank attempting to roll across them. After the June 6th landings, these obstacles littered the beaches by the thousands. They were everywhere, and they were made of good, heavy, weldable steel. Cullen recognized that the very material the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop the American advance could be cut apart, welded into prongs, and bolted to the front of a Sherman tank, transforming a beach obstacle into a hedgerow destroyer. Working with whatever welding equipment was available in the field, Cullen and his crew fabricated a set of 4 steel teeth. each roughly 2 feet long, fashioned from the cut beams of the beach obstacles, and bolted them to the bow of a Sherman. But the device was neither elegant nor polished. It looked like something a blacksmith might have made in an afternoon. But when the modified tank was driven directly at a hedgerow embankment, something extraordinary happened. The prongs bit into the base of the earthen wall at ground level. They did not climb the embankment. They drove into it, below its center of gravity, using the Sherman's 33 tons of weight as a driving force. The roots cracked. The earth split. The hedge peeled open like a door being forced from its hinges. In less than 3 minutes, a gap wide enough for a tank to pass through appeared where solid wall had been before. The Sherman had not climbed the hedgerow. It had eaten through it. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley attended a formal demonstration of the Cullen device at a field somewhere in the Normandy countryside. He watched as Sherman tanks equipped with the prongs drove directly into hedgerow after hedgerow, crashing through embankments that had stopped American armor for weeks. Bradley stood in silence for a moment after the demonstration, then ordered the device fitted to as many tanks as possible, as quickly as possible. The order went out across the First Army's entire armored force. Welding teams worked around the clock. By July 22nd, the device was demonstrated again for General George S. Patton and personnel from the 3rd Armored Division, who immediately began their own production program. The device was given a name. Soldiers called it the Rhinoceros. The tanks that bore it were called Rhinos. The name came from the tusks, yes, but also from something else, something in the nature of the thing. A rhinoceros does not go around an obstacle. It goes through it. That was the spirit of the invention entirely. The pace of manufacture was itself a testament to what the United States had become in the years since December 1941. And field workshops across the American sector cut and shaped the steel prongs from the German beach obstacles. The irony of the source material was not lost on the men who worked with it. The steel the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop the Americans from getting ashore was now being used to break through the Germans' own defensive line. The barrier had become the battering ram. The obstacle had become the solution. It was in miniature the story of the entire war. Just the Americans had arrived with less experience and no home territory at stake, and they were making it up as they went, improvising, adapting, solving. While the German army, which had once seemed an unstoppable mechanical force, was now being met by the full weight of a society that, when mobilized, could convert its own enemies' weapons into tools of liberation. By late July 1944, more than 60% of all Sherman tanks in the U.S. First Army had been fitted with the Rhino cutters. Yet the numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. 60%, not a prototype, not a handful of experimental vehicles, a majority. A majority of the American armored force, refitted in the field using salvaged steel in under 2 weeks. No contract was written, no factory was mobilized, no procurement bureaucracy was consulted. The solution came from a sergeant, was approved by a general, and was manufactured by the men who would use it, on the ground, in the field, and in the shadow of the enemy's guns. The Germans did not know it was coming. That is the essential, devastating truth of what followed. The Wehrmacht had watched the bocage hold the Americans for 7 weeks. 7 weeks of slow progress, of costly field-by-field fighting, of American armor funneling itself into predictable kill zones while German machine gunners and mortar teams extracted their terrible price. The German defensive line in Normandy was battered, yes, eroded by Allied air power, and stretched by the British and Canadian operations further east around Caen, reduced in men and material with each passing week. But it held. The Panzer Division, one of the finest armored formations in the entire German military, had been ground down from its original strength to a ghost of itself. By the last week of July 1944, it could field only approximately 2,200 combat troops, 12 Panzer IV tanks, 16 Panthers fit for action, and perhaps 30 more tanks in various states of repair. The 84th Corps, holding the line in the American sector south of Saint-Lô, was stretched to the edge of its capacity. But its officers had reason to believe, that the terrain would continue to do much of their work for them. The bocage was still there. The hedgerows had not moved. As long as the American armor could not penetrate them directly, the line could hold. They had no way of knowing that. Yet in the fields and workshops behind the American line, the tusks were being welded on. They had no way of knowing that the very steel they had planted in the sand at low tide on the beaches of Normandy had been cut down and reborn as the weapon that would destroy them. July 25th, 1944. The morning of Operation Cobra. At 9:38 hours, the skies over Saint-Lô darkened, not with clouds, but with aircraft. What more than 2,400 Allied bombers, medium bombers and heavies flying from England and from bases in the south, descended in successive waves on a narrow corridor of German-held territory less than 5 miles wide along the Perrier Road. The bombardment that followed was unlike anything the Western Front had yet produced. Thousands of tons of high explosives fell on the positions of the Panzer Lehr Division and the supporting German formations defending the sector. The earth heaved. Tanks were thrown from their treads, command posts were buried, anti-tank gun crews were killed at their weapons, communications were severed. The survivors described afterward a world turned upside down, men flung through the air, veterans of the Eastern Front trembling in their foxholes, officers unable to communicate with their own units. The Panzer Lehr Division, already diminished, was essentially destroyed as a coherent fighting force in the space of hours. Then the Rhinos moved. The American infantry advanced first, as always, the foot soldiers moving into the cratered landscape ahead of the armor, clearing German anti-tank teams from the hedgerow embankments, eliminating the Panzerfausts and the Panzerschrecks that could have slaughtered the tanks at close range. Behind them came the Shermans, dozens of them, then hundreds, bearing on their bows those 4 jagged steel prongs, those improvised tusks of repurposed iron. Those instruments assembled from the wreckage of the Germans' own fortifications. And when they reached the hedgerows that had stopped every tank and broken every plan for 7 grinding weeks, they did not slow down. They did not look for the gaps. They did not wait for engineers to blast holes in the embankments. They drove straight into them. The prongs bit. The earth gave way. The hedgerows tore open. Just German soldiers who survived the initial bombardment and took their positions behind the remaining hedgerow walls saw something that violated every calculation they had made. The Shermans were not approaching the gaps. The Shermans were making their own gaps, anywhere they chose. At any point along the hedgerow line, the tank would drive forward, the steel teeth would sink into the embankment at its base, and within seconds, not minutes, seconds, a section of wall that had stood for centuries and held the American advance for weeks would collapse, split apart, and fold aside. The tank would push through into the field on the other side before the defending crew had time to reposition, before the anti-tank gun could be swung to cover the new breach, before the mortar team could adjust its pre-sighted coordinates for a gap that had not existed a moment ago. Yet the entire German defensive system in the bocage was built on a single assumption, that the hedgerows were impassable to armor without going through the gaps. The Rhino cutter made that assumption obsolete in a single stroke. Every German machine gun emplacement that had been dug into an embankment to cover a specific gap was now irrelevant. Every anti-tank gun positioned at a lane intersection was covering a route that the Americans were no longer required to use. Every pre-sighted mortar coordinate was aimed at a place the advancing American tanks simply chose not to occupy. The entire interlocking system of the German bocage defense, the system that had extracted 40,000 American casualties in 7 weeks, was suddenly and completely invalidated. Not by superior firepower, not by numbers, by 4 pieces of welded steel on the front of a tank. Field reports from the German units in the path of the breakthrough described scenes of confusion and disintegration. Units that had been confident of their ability to hold their positions found those positions bypassed, surrounded, or overwhelmed before they could be repositioned. The 84th Corps, which had held the line south of Saint-Lô with something close to defiant certainty as recently as the evening of July 24th, was trapped by late July 28th. The German command structure, and already degraded by the bombardment, collapsed under the speed of the American advance. By the time Operation Cobra reached its conclusion, approximately 10,000 German soldiers had been killed in the breakthrough and its immediate aftermath. Another 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German 7th Army, which had defended Normandy against the Americans since the first hours of D-Day, was in full retreat, and then en route. The transformation was total. In the space of 6 days, the campaign that had spent 7 weeks crawling forward in the mud at the cost of blood and anguish became a sprint across the French countryside. American armored columns poured southward through the gap the Rhinos had torn open. General Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, raced west into Brittany and then east into the heart of France with a speed that stunned even the Allied high command. The hedgerows, those ancient walls, those natural fortresses, yet those 1,000-year barriers, were behind them now. The open ground was ahead. The war in Western Europe had changed in a fundamental way, and the instrument of that change had been born in a field, from the hands of an ordinary man, from the steel his enemy had left behind on the beach. It is worth dwelling for a moment on that origin, on the material fact of where the steel came from. The Czech hedgehog anti-tank obstacles that the Germans had planted on the beaches of Normandy were, shown in the original German strategic logic, a symbol of total defensive certainty. They represented the engineering of immovability, the idea that the beaches could be made impassable, that the landing craft would be stopped in the surf, that the Atlantic Wall could hold the world at bay by the brute logic of iron and geometry. When the Allies came ashore on June 6th, those obstacles failed to stop them. But they remained, scattered across the sand in their thousands, inert and purposeless. Yes, they should have rusted there, remnants of a failed plan, corroding evidence of a strategic miscalculation. Instead, American soldiers picked them up. They carried them inland. They cut them apart with torches. They welded the pieces to their tanks. And those pieces, that same German iron, that same steel that had been placed in the path of the American advance as a final act of defiance, became the instrument by which the American advance finally and irrevocably broke through. Yeah, there is no more complete emblem of what the Second World War meant for American arms and for the ideology of freedom itself. The enemy's wall, in American hands, became the means of liberation. For the German soldiers who faced the Rhino tanks in those last days of July 1944, the psychological impact was as decisive as the physical one. They had been told and had believed that the bocage was their fortress. They had watched the American armor fail against it for 7 weeks. Yet they had drawn from that fact a conclusion about the limits of American military capability, a conclusion that the speed of the American industrial machine, the profligacy with which the Americans could afford to replace destroyed equipment, and the raw ingenuity of American soldiers in the field had just rendered entirely and permanently false. What the German defenders saw advancing through their hedgerows in the last week of July was not simply a modified tank. Yet it was evidence of something they had systematically underestimated from the beginning: the capacity of a free society, when roused to full mobilization, to solve problems that no other kind of society could solve. Not because free men are born knowing more than anyone else, but because they are free to look at a beach covered in their enemy's obstacles and ask, what else could this be used for? The post-war testimonies of German officers who served in Normandy returned again and again to a version of the same theme. They had expected the American advance to be predictable. They had expected American commanders to follow doctrine, to funnel armor through controlled routes, to do what armies did. What they had not expected was the sergeant with the welding torch. They had not expected the improvised answer. They had not expected that. In the time it took the German high command to receive a briefing and issue a counterorder, the American army would have already built the solution and driven it through the wall. This is the weight of the steel tusk. This is what those 4 jagged prongs carried on their blades when they bit into the Norman earth. They were not merely a mechanical device, they were a philosophy made physical. The philosophy that a problem is only a problem until someone decides to fix it. But the philosophy that the materials for liberation are often found in the very architecture of oppression. The philosophy that in a society where ordinary men are trusted with extraordinary responsibility, the solutions that save nations do not always arrive from the top down. They arrive sometimes from a sergeant in a muddy field with a box of salvaged steel and a very clear idea of what needs to be done. Sergeant Curtis Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention. Yet he returned home after the war, went back to civilian life in New Jersey, and died on November 20th, 1963, just 2 days before a president would be killed in Dallas, an event that shook the world he had helped preserve. His name is not remembered the way Eisenhower's name is remembered, or Patton's. He was a sergeant. He did what sergeants do. He solved the problem in front of him with what he had in the time available, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. But in the years after the war, Allied historians and German military analysts studied the Normandy campaign with exhaustive care. They counted the divisions, the tanks, the tons of bombs, the miles of advance per day. They constructed charts and models of the logistical apparatus that had sustained the American force. The 86,000 tanks, the 297,000 aircraft, the millions of rounds of ammunition, and the food and fuel and medical supplies that crossed the Atlantic and piled up in the English countryside, and then surged across the Channel and into France. They noted, with appropriate awe, the industrial scale of the American war effort, the fact that at the peak of its wartime production, the United States was manufacturing almost as many munitions as all of its allies and enemies combined. But the Battle of the Bocage was not won by those statistics. Those statistics were the context, with the vast underlying architecture of American power that made the solution possible. What won the Battle of the Bocage was a man with a cutting torch and a simple idea. And what gave that man the freedom to act on his idea, to propose it, build it, test it, and bring it to the attention of his commanding general without waiting for a directive from above, was the culture that had produced him. The culture that trusted a non-commissioned officer to think. So the culture that did not demand that creativity flow only downward through a chain of command. The culture that said, if you have a better idea, let's hear it. This is the truth the Rhino cutter tells, standing quiet and rusted in the museums that now preserve it. It is not a story about industrial superiority, though that superiority was real and decisive. It is not a story about material abundance, though the abundance was staggering, and the Germans knew it and feared it. But it is a story about what material abundance means when it is guided by a free people, a people who are permitted to think, permitted to fail, permitted to try again, and trusted, in the end, to make the right choice at the right moment. The hedgerows of Normandy still stand, diminished now in number and worn smooth by 70 years of peace and the slow erosion of farming that no longer needs walls as thick as fortresses. The sunken lanes are still there, yet the earthen embankments are still there. On quiet mornings in the Calvados and Manche departments, when the mist comes in from the Atlantic and settles between the hedges, the landscape looks almost as it did in June of 1944. Almost unchanged, almost the same walls, almost the same silence. But the silence is different now. It is the silence of a place where a terrible thing happened and then was overcome, where men died in numbers that defy any easy accounting, and where, hid somewhere behind the American line, a sergeant held a piece of German steel in his hand and decided it was time to stop being stopped. The prongs went in. The wall gave way. The tanks came through. And the world on the other side, the world beyond the bocage, beyond the wall, beyond the assumption that freedom could be caged and held and bottled up behind ancient earthworks, opened. It has been open ever since.